What's up, everyone? It's Jay. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to listen to the Gritty Fantasy Football Podcast. I hope everyone had a great Valentine's Day. If you had a Valentine this year, way to go. I'm proud of you. And if you didn't, that's okay. I'm proud of you too. Now, you as the listener might understandably be wondering, Jay, our amazing, talented podcast host with a really soothing voice, did you have a Valentine this year? No, guys, no. I did not have a Valentine this year. I'm hosting a fantasy football podcast. Of course I didn't. I spent my Valentine's Day planning for this episode. Let's not let that go to waste, and let's get into it. So today's episode is going to get a little philosophical. I'm going to be talking more about a general approach to fantasy football, rather than pointing out specific players or trends, like last week's episode. And I know it's not the most exciting thing, and definitely not something that everyone wants to hear. But it is something that I think a lot of people need to hear. Why is it important to refine our approach to fantasy football? Because success in fantasy football is dependent on making the right decisions. Decision making isn't just based on knowing stats and player situations. It also requires a great deal of thinking, so it's important to make sure that we think about things the right way. For example, when you're doing a start-sit decision, you probably don't just start a player off of one stat. Like, you don't just go through your roster and find the 3 guys with the highest yards per route run or the highest total yards and just start those guys. And we definitely do take those things into account. But we also take a lot of other things into account, like matchups and potential game script. The way we piece all those bits of information together to make a decision is related to how we think about it. So if we want to get better at fantasy football, we have to get better at thinking too. On the topic of start-sits, we answer a lot of those on our social media accounts, especially TikTok. One of our commenters asked about starting DK Metcalf against the Dolphins. Spencer recommended keeping Metcalf on the bench because the Dolphins at the time were the toughest matchup for wide receivers. So we had almost a full season's worth of data of wide receivers scoring less points against the Dolphins. On top of that, they also ran a coverage look that DK Metcalf had struggled against. So Spencer said to sit him. He ended up scoring 14.5 PPR points, and the guy came back to let us know that we made the wrong call. But DK Metcalf's stat line wasn't anything crazy. He played almost the whole game, and he only had 3 targets. He did have 55 yards and a touchdown, which was good, but most of his points came on a long touchdown. And that's not to discredit his stat line or say that it wasn't legitimate. But the fact that most of his points came on one play shows that it wasn't very reliable. So was it wrong to keep Metcalf on the bench? Spoiler, no, it wasn't. But to explain this, we need to understand process versus outcome. Process is how you make your decisions. In this case, Spencer made his decision based on the matchup. The commenter made his decision based on the advice of a TikTok fantasy account. But regardless of how you do it, that's your process. Our outcome is the result of the decision made by our process. So based on these standards, our outcome would be that we were wrong. The problem with this is that it leads to a very binary way of thinking. You're either right or you're wrong. You either start the right guy or you leave production on the bench. There's not a lot of gray area. But there's always gray area. This might be a familiar experience for you. You spend all week thinking about who to start in your lineup. On Sunday morning, you feel pretty good about the decisions you made. But then the games happen, and a guy on your bench outscores one of your starters. Then you feel like an idiot because you should have seen this coming. It's all so crystal clear all of a sudden. The right choice was obvious. But then we move on to the next week, and it's not so crystal clear anymore. The gray area comes back in, and we spend days making our decision again. Just because your outcome is that you were wrong, doesn't mean that you were wrong to make that decision. Just because Trey Tucker scored 40 points in week 3, doesn't mean that you were wrong to bench him. Because here's the thing. You can control your process, but you can't control your outcome. And this might not make any sense because our outcome is the direct result of the decision made by our process. We control our outcome in the same way that we control a coin toss. Sure, the way we flick the coin up in the air will have an impact on what side it lands on. Maybe if we flicked it harder, it would have landed on a different side. But once we let go of that coin, all of a sudden there's wind blowing. Maybe someone is breathing super aggressively on it. And now we can't really control what side it's going to land on. So even though we had an impact, we're not really controlling the outcome. And that's the same case with our fantasy football decisions. To illustrate that point further, let's talk about the Monty Hall Problem. The Monty Hall Problem is pretty popular, so you might have heard of it. But just in case anyone hasn't, I'll run through it right now. Imagine you're on a game show, and there's 3 doors. Behind one of the doors is a car. So the host tells you to pick a door, and you pick one of the doors. Now there's the door that you picked, and then there's the 2 remaining that you didn't pick. Now the host says, I'm going to take one of the 2 doors that you didn't pick, and I'm going to remove one of them that doesn't have a car behind it. So now all that's left is the door that you picked initially, and the other door remaining. Now the host asks you, Do you want to keep your door or do you want to switch it? Now, a lot of people will say it doesn't matter because there's one car and there's two doors. So there's a 50-50 chance regardless of whether you switch or stay. But that's actually not the case. By switching your door, you have a 66% chance of winning that car. Now, maybe you don't understand that, and it's not too important to know the math behind this, but I'll still explain it a little differently. Imagine instead of 3 doors, there's 100 doors. And the situation is still the same. One of them has a car behind it. Now, of the 100 doors, the host tells you to pick one of them. Now, the door you picked, you have a 1 in 100% chance of the car being behind it. And of all the other doors, there's a 99% chance that the car is behind one of the other doors. Of course there is, because there's one door that you picked and 99 other doors. Now imagine the host says, I'm going to take away 98 of the doors that don't have the car behind it. So all that's left is the door that you picked initially and the one door remaining. Are you going to switch? And the answer is yes, absolutely every time. Because by switching, you have a 99% chance of winning that car. You picked your door with a 1 in 100% chance of the car being behind your door. And there was a 99% chance of the car being behind one of the other doors. Now that there's only one of the other doors remaining, there's a 99% chance that it's behind that one door. Maybe this still doesn't make sense, but my point here isn't to confuse you. You don't really need to know the math behind it. You just need to understand that by switching the door every single time, you have a higher chance of winning that car. So what does this have to do with fantasy football? The Monty Hall problem follows the same concept of process versus outcome. There's a few different processes you could follow. You could choose to keep your door every time, and if you do that, you're going to have a hit rate of about 33%. You could choose to switch your door every time, and that's proven to be the best method. That's going to lead you to a success rate of 66%. Or maybe 66% isn't enough for you, so you're going to try and guess when to switch and when to stay. That might work in the short term. Maybe you'll do it 5 times and you'll get it right 5 times. Or maybe you'll do it 10 times and you'll get it right 8 times. But the more attempts you get, the larger the sample size grows, that success rate gets smaller and smaller until it falls below 66%. And if you don't believe me, you can try a Monty Hall simulator yourself. But in this case, the pursuit of 100% leads to an even worse outcome. And it's okay to pursue 100%. It's okay to look at your lineup, see that you made the wrong start, and feel a little bit upset about it because we want to be right every time. That's not a bad thing. But we can't let our chase of perfection lead us to an outcome that's worse than what we had before. Sometimes 66% is the best we can do. We have to be able to accept the fact that we didn't win the car we wanted, but we did have the right decision-making process. And maybe this feels silly to say, because who gets to go on a game show more than once? And fantasy football may feel like that because our playoff games are a one-and-done situation. You have to score the most points or else you get eliminated. So having a good decision-making process, if you don't score the most points, doesn't matter as much. That's why we, as fantasy football players, need to change our definition of a successful outcome. Winning the car one time, starting the right player one time, isn't success. Success is winning the car more times than not in the long run. You'll play at least 14 matchups in a fantasy football season. Losing one of them doesn't mean much if you win more often than not across the rest of your seasons. Even if that loss comes in the championship, then so be it. If you have a proven decision-making process, even if it leads to an undesired outcome, you're more likely to have sustained success in the future. Maybe we can't control the outcome of a coin toss. We can't know for sure if it'll land on heads or tails. But maybe we could learn a way to flick it that makes it land on one side more often than not. And I don't know if that's actually possible with a coin toss, but that's besides the point. This doesn't mean you can't change anything. We should always evaluate our process to see if it's really working. Our process is sacred because it's the only thing in fantasy football that we can control. So we should make sure we take care of it. When we make a decision, we have to have an evidence-based reason to justify doing it. So now let's say it's the end of the season and Trey Tucker has scored under 10 points for 5 straight weeks. We might think, he's due for a blow-up game, I'm going to start him. But oh my goodness, Valentine, that is not the shot. We have to ask ourselves what our process is here, and is it evidence-based? By saying that he's due for a breakout, we're saying that him not being productive for 5 weeks is a sign that he'll be productive now. I could find a guy on the waiver wire who has scored 0 points across the last 5 weeks. That doesn't mean that he's going to score a lot of points this week. That's a bad process, and chances are that that line of thinking isn't going to lead us to sustained success, even if it works for this week. It's the same thing as us trying to guess on the game show if we should keep our door or switch. It's not logical at that point. It's gambling. If we look at DK Metcalf again, will a team allowing the fewest points to fantasy wide receivers have an impact on how much a fantasy wide receiver scores? Does running a difficult coverage look impact how much they score? Yes. So even if he does okay, doesn't mean you were wrong to bench him. Success in fantasy football requires level-headedness. We have to be able to learn to not overreact to individual data points and to view everything in the big picture instead. Last week, I talked about why we should avoid drafting low-end tight end ones in fantasy drafts. But sometimes someone from that range will end up being a good pick. That doesn't necessarily mean that we need to go back on our process and start drafting players from there again. We have to be able to look at the data and understand that individual hits sometimes happen, but that drafting here tends to be disadvantageous. We need to ignore the hits and stay true to our process to have sustained success going forward. So maybe you don't have a Valentine this year. That's okay. It doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. But maybe 10 years go by and you still don't have one. It might be time to change that hairstyle, buddy, because something's not working here. Or maybe you're a great guy who's really nice, compassionate, smart, funny. You're the type of guy that would buy a girl flowers for the first date. That's awesome. Don't change. Because maybe you don't have a Valentine this year, but that's just this year. Over time, it's not going to stay that way. And we have to accept that for now, because sometimes 66% is the best we can do. That's all I have to say for now. I'm going to gritty on out of here, and I hope you guys have a gritty-tastic rest of your day.